Murderous Jello, the Blob creature, origins, anatomy, powers, and franchise explained. When the Blob was released in the fall of 1958, little did people expect that it would become a cult classic someday. This independent B-movie was made on a shoestring budget and performed miserably at the box office.
Oh man, and where's the big bad monster?
Over the years, it had a sequel and a gorier remake in 1988. And today, B-movie lovers put this in their list of their favorite sci-fi horror flicks. The movie also influenced works like Slither by James Gunn and Ghostbusters 2. In fact, the Mind Flayer from Stranger Things is also a byproduct of the Blob. So what is it that is so special about the movie? One of the main assets of this film is the unstoppable, undulating monster. Another drawing point is the concept that was different from other films that were being produced at that time.
It's kind of like a mass that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Come on, Steve, makes sense.
The popular monster flicks during that era were centered around grown men and women as protagonists. Teenagers were barely portrayed as crucial characters, and even if they were featured, their roles were restricted to a nuisance. The Blob changed with capable, competent teenagers trying to save their town from the impending danger. There are several other things that are special about the Blob, and this video will be all about diving into the depths of the franchise. Before we get into the explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click from you, but means a lot to us. Thank you. Let's begin.
Stand still. Don't move. Must have absorbed the old man completely.
The Blob, 1958. The story is premised in a small town called Downingtown in Pennsylvania. Steve, a teenager, is out with his girlfriend Jane when they observe something like a falling star. They decide to head to the point where the strange meteor-like thing landed. In the meantime, an old man heard the crash and went out to explore. When he pokes at the meteor with a stick, the hard outer surface breaks open, and a jelly-like substance is found inside. This blob-like thing turns out to be a living organism, and it latches onto his hand. The old man tries to shake it off desperately, but the blob keeps reattaching itself even stronger. In a state of sheer shock, the old man runs onto the road, and Steve and Jane find him there in this condition. Steve immediately takes him to the local doctor.
No, Doc, we picked him up out on the road. He was screaming about this thing on his hand.
Dr. Holland is intrigued by this strange occurrence and sends Steve to investigate further at the crash site. Meanwhile, he plans to amputate the old man's arm because nothing seems to be able to detach the blob. However, the blob completely consumes the old man as well as Dr. Holland. With each prey, the blob increases in size. Steve and Jane get the police, but when they arrive at the clinic, there are no signs of the doctor or the creature, and the cops dismiss their story. They are sent home with their fathers, but they manage to sneak out and gather their friend. Together, they try to warn the entire town about the presence of this vicious monster. All this while, the blob goes on a hunting spree and consumes a janitor at a grocery store, a mechanic, and a bar full of late-night drinkers. It keeps growing in size and seems to get more murderous with each kill. Steve and Jane raise the fire alarms and air raid sirens in the town. As the drama unfolds, the blob enters a theater and proceeds to move into the seating area, sending the audience away in a panic. The townspeople are now aware of the blob's presence, and they come to terms with the danger it brings. Steve and Jane get trapped in a diner as the blob grows to gigantic proportions. The police use a power line to try and kill it, but the ploy doesn't work, and the restaurant is set on fire as a result. In a desperate bid to save themselves, the owners use the fire extinguishers to stop the flames, and the advancing blob recoils immediately.
It's cold. That's why it didn't come in the icebox after us. It can't stand cold.
Steve remembers the incident at the grocery store where the blob retreated from the freezer and infers that the blob cannot withstand cold. Jane's father and Steve's friends head to the high school and get as many fire extinguishers as they can. They use these to freeze the blob, and an Air Force jet transports the blob to the North Pole, where it can safely remain frozen indefinitely. The movie ends as we see the plane dropping off the blob in a remote Arctic landscape. Our take on the movie. The story has everything that one would expect from a drive-in B movie, but the narrative is not restricted to the cheap thrills alone. The tension-filled atmosphere is a rewarding experience, while the movie takes a turn from conventional horror tropes. It is not often that you see the hero knowing the nature of the monster and how to deal with it. Steve is aware of everything, and his only frustration is that he cannot seem to convince the authorities about the threat. You will feel connected to the characters, and every time the blob eats someone, it is grotesque. As for the cast, they did a commendable job, especially because not all of the teenagers in the movie were teenagers in real life. Steve McQueen, for instance, was 28, and he is impressive as an earnest and cool young man.
Hello, son.
Dad, I saw something terrible tonight.
And nobody will believe us.
Anita Corsat, who played Jane, might be less defined. But when Steve starts doubting himself, she is the first one to help him back. She is certainly more than just a romantic partner for the hero, and the narrative shows glimpses of a mature character in her.
How do you know I did?
Because I know you.
You could go ahead and say that the terror bits are not as effective today as they used to be, but we beg to differ. We feel that the scary element in this film has managed to stand the test of time. Whenever the monster is on screen, you don't see any goofiness, and the horror is played straight. It is the star of the show, and we are convinced from the very first scene that it is a great threat.
I can't get it off!
Well, here, let me try. Maybe I can get it off.
In today's world of CGI, the practical effects used for the blob are fascinating. It was made using a mixture of silicone and red dye, and after it consumed more victims, they would add more dye to make it appear redder. Like we have already discussed, the teenage protagonists were the focus, and clearly, the movie wanted to cater to a young audience. The climax is quite innovative, where you see the blob monster being frozen and taken to the Arctic. The last line of the movie hits different in the modern-day climate change era, when you hear them say,
Yeah, as long as the Arctic stays cold.
Today, the movie has an impressive reach in horror and sci-fi genres, and everything from the dated but effective practical effects to the uniqueness of the storytelling seems to have worked well. The Blob Remake, 1988. It all starts in a familiar way as we see a meteorite crashing near a town called Arborville in California. An elderly transient goes on to inspect the sphere, and a jelly-like entity latches onto his hand. Brian, Meg, and Paul are 3 high school students who encounter this man and take him to the hospital. Brian is a rebellious biker who often tests the limits of the law with his antics. Meg is the pretty and popular lady in high school, and Paul is a successful football player. After getting the man admitted, Brian leaves the scene. Paul notices that the lower half of the man's body has started to melt from the exposure to the jelly-like substance. He immediately calls for help, but it is too late as the blob now attaches itself to him. Meg arrives only to find Paul being engulfed by this growing blob. She tries to free him from this entity, but one of his arms is torn from his body on impact. Meg gets thrown against a wall and is knocked unconscious. The blob oozes out of the hospital, and it is seen disappearing into a manhole inside a sewer. Brian and Meg try to reach out to the authorities and let them know about the bizarre entity that is on the loose. However, the police don't believe them, and they meet at a diner to talk about the strange incidents. Suddenly, the blob reappears and takes down the diner's handyman headfirst through the sink drain. Brian and Meg hide inside the walk-in freezer, and the blob gives up the hunt because it's sensitive to cold. It goes on to eat the town's sheriff and the owner of the diner and heads back into the sewers. Meg and Brian head to the police station one more time, and they learn that Deputy Briggs has headed towards the landing site of the meteor. There is also some military activity that is being led by a scientist named Dr. Meadows. He orders the whole town to be quarantined immediately. Brian manages to escape from a military van and get to his motorbike. However, Meg isn't as lucky, and she is taken to town. She gets to know that her younger brother Kevin has been missing after he went to a local theater to watch some slasher flicks with his friend. The Blob raids the theater, and everyone inside is attacked. It keeps growing in size as it consumes more and more victims, but Meg somehow manages to save her brother. In the meantime, Brian makes a startling discovery while eavesdropping on a conversation between Dr. Meadows and his assistant. He gets to know that the Blob is actually a biological warfare experiment gone wrong during the Cold War. The Blob has now chased Meg, Kevin, and his friend Eddie into the sewers, and Dr. Meadows decides to trap the creature inside. He seems to be okay with the idea of sacrificing the kids for the greater good.
You make it, Meg! Come on! Run, Kevin, run!
Inside the sewers, Eddie is devoured. Brian manages to save Meg just in time, and now he confronts Dr. Meadows in front of the whole town. However, the Blob drags him into the sewer using one of its tentacles. The town's reverend is now accidentally set on fire, and Meg tries to douse the flames with a fire extinguisher. When some of the blast hits the Blob, it retreats immediately, and she comes to the conclusion that the creature cannot tolerate cold. Everyone tries to use fire extinguishers on the Blob, but nothing seems to work as the creature has grown too large. Brian heads to the town's garage and gets a snowmaker truck with loads of liquid nitrogen attached to it. Just as the Blob is about to consume Meg and her family, Brian hits it with snow. The creature is agitated and charges towards Brian. Meg tries to lure it away from him, and she has cleverly rigged an explosive with the canisters containing liquid nitrogen.
Come on, you son of a bitch.
The charge sets off, and the Blob is frozen immediately with all the liquid nitrogen. It shatters into pieces, and those fragments are taken to the ice house in the town. The final scene of the movie is quite disturbing, as we see the Reverend disfigured and in a disturbed state of mind. He is preaching some doomsday sermon and suggests that imminent destruction is about to hit humanity. As he preaches to his audience, we see him holding up a glass jar that has a piece of the Blob that he took from the ice house. We see it moving inside, and the film comes to an end. Marvelous reviews! We are not a big fan of remakes over originals, but this one did hit the right notes. Even John Carpenter's The Thing is a remake, and we don't see anyone complaining about that. This classic reboot of the 1958 movie is another entertaining monster flick with loads of entertainment. The fast-paced narrative is coupled with an engaging script, and fireworks are all set to follow. We loved what they did with the story, because the slight change about the origin of the Blob monster is quite interesting. It is not a blatant copy of the 1958 version, but there are similarities that were retained. For instance, the Blob is still susceptible to cold, and this film also shows young protagonists in a good way. Kevin Dillon does a good job with his role as a snarky, rebellious young man who takes a stand for what is right. Shawnee Smith is impressive as the female lead, and her performance is perfectly suited for a B-movie. This Blob doesn't pull back on the punches, and there are times when you will witness innocent, likable characters dying horrific deaths. They even ignored the taboo about killing kids in horror flicks. It is clearly a lot gorier than the original, and is not meant for the squeamish. The director, Chuck Russell, does a brilliant job when it comes to recreating the suspense-filled atmosphere of the original movie. At $19 million, the budget for the movie was several times more than its predecessor, and it shows in the special effects and visuals. Almost $9 million went towards perfecting the visual effects, and it certainly paid off. It is heartening to see the absence of a CGI-generated mess, and the film makes good use of old-school special effects. They use Methosil, a thickening agent for milkshakes, to portray the Blob slime and juices. It might sound a tad condescending, but the special effects are quite good for the time. Yes, it is cheesy, but it is so much fun to watch the Blob consuming people in a disgusting manner. You can see the half-melted outlines of people inside the creature, and it did prove some effective shock value back in the day. If we have one complaint regarding the story, it has to be the climax. They clearly prepared for a climax with that ending, but that never materialized. One of the biggest gains was how the Blob managed to imbibe the old and the new into something beautiful. This is a must-watch for those who have appreciated the original classic, and also those who are willing to get acquainted with the world of the Blob.
Oh my god.
Beware the Blob, Son of Blob, 1972. This lesser-known sequel to the original film was released in the year 1972. The story is premised 15 years after the events of the original, and it starts off with a pipeline engineer coming home in Los Angeles after working on a project in the North Pole. This guy named Chester has brought a small sample of some strange frozen substance that was uncovered with a bulldozer at his job site. Little does he know that this mysterious frozen thing is actually a piece of the Blob. He takes it to the laboratory to be analyzed. All hell breaks loose when the scientists allow it to thaw, and the Blob is reanimated. It immediately goes on an eating spree and consumes a fly, a kitten, and even Chester's wife. In a bizarre fourth wall sequence, we see Chester being devoured by the Blob, just as he is watching a television broadcast of the film The Blob. One of his friends, Lisa, walks in at that moment as Chester is being consumed. She somehow manages to escape, but nobody believes her ridiculous account. The Blob keeps growing to gigantic proportions and starts consuming victims from all over the town.
That's my mallet and chisel.
Slowly, the list of missing individuals starts to increase, and people start to comprehend the presence of something sinister. The Blob even attacks Lisa and her boyfriend, but they stay put inside Bobby's truck. The creature starts to figure out a way to get inside the vehicle, when suddenly, the air conditioning is switched on. Since the Blob is averse to anything cold, it retreats immediately.
Something from the moon.
We then see the Blob preying on people in a skating rink and a bowling alley. As more and more people fall to this creature, the size keeps growing, and it starts to become unstoppable. Just in the nick of time, Bobby activates the ice mechanism in the skating rink and freezes the Blob. The television crew arrives and starts filming the frozen Blob, but their bright flash bulbs create enough heat for a small part of the creature to melt. It soon heads towards the sheriff, who is giving an interview on national television, and the movie ends on this unnerving note. Our thoughts on this movie. Beware is no more than a comic sequel to the original horror flick. It might have an all-star cast, but it's ultimately not known much for a reason. You can watch it for the pea soup thick 70s atmosphere, but don't go in with unrealistic expectations. You will witness some hokey special effects by Tim Barr, and the corny score by Mort Garson adds to the casual nature of the narrative. The script is rather silly and unpolished, but that is precisely the charm of this film. There are some goofy moments, such as the scene where the bald victim in the bathtub watches the gelatinous threat oozing underneath his bathroom door, and runs through the streets screaming as funny music plays on. It is believed that the director, Larry Hagman, had a week or two free in his schedule and used it to make this movie and have some fun. He put together a bizarre storyline and some fun cameos to create a direct sequel to the original film. The cast delivers an average performance, with the likes of Robert Walker Jr. and Gwen Guilford doing justice to their individual roles. Robert even did his own stunts, despite the presence of a professional stunt person on the sets.
Please listen to me. There's no time for any explanation. We gotta get everybody out of here before it's too late.
You might be disappointed with the fact that this movie has nothing new to offer and portrays a similar set of characters and the same old chaos unfolding around the Blob monster. The die-hard fans of the Blob might be dissatisfied, but this movie will still be a fun watch for a casual movie night over a couple of beers.
Look at me. Do I look like somebody's playing a practical joke? Am I laughing?
Future of the franchise. Not many are aware that horror veteran Rob Zombie had plans of working on his own version of the Blob. He had planned to portray the Blob as something a bit darker than was previously seen, and it would be a gigantic red ball of gloop. This Blob would also possess the people it consumed, and they would be turned into some kind of zombie. The very idea of Rob Zombie taking the Blob sounds intriguing, but unfortunately, his plans never materialized. Later, Simon West took over as director in charge of a remake. In 2015, it was announced that a remake would be created with Richard Saperstein and Brian Whitten as producers, alongside the producer of the original, Jack H. Harris, who would be the executive producer. There have been a few years of silence on this, and that is not always good news for an upcoming movie. Harris also passed away at the age of 98, and it could have been curtains for the project. However, the only consolation is that the production company, Goldcrest Films, indicates they are still involved. We just pray that they don't spoil this gem of a franchise with goofy CGI effects or a crazy storyline. We wouldn't hope too much because we hate being disappointed. And let's just keep our fingers crossed for this one.
And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.